Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a brief review of what we covered in the review session. Again, because of all the technical difficulties I've had, I just can't get two laptops to work at the same time, so I wasn't able to record that. But again, I'll give you an overview of what we talked about. This is going to be very low tech, so I'm not going to do any video editing or anything. I'll just read off of the review sheet that I've already posted in Module 8. And I'll just go over a couple of the topics and discuss some of the key points which we went over in the review session. So the final, which you're going to be taking in maybe 12 to however many hours from now, 15 hours, is going to be 20 multiple choice questions instead of 30 because there's only 2 chapters in this instance. So it would be half and half. So half the questions are going to come from materials from Module 7. The other half are going to come from materials from Module 8. Or do I have it as modules? Yes, Module 7 and Module 8. There'll be 2 labeling and graphing questions. And I've already told everybody the focus of those is going to be the understanding of behavior chain and also understanding schedules of reinforcement, okay? Specifically, the graphical depiction of schedules of reinforcement. Okay, so you guys have had a chance to do an assignment with a behavioral chain, which if you've submitted the assignment to me, you should now have gotten feedback. So take a look at that. If you haven't submitted the assignment, if you're holding off because you're still not sure, go ahead and give it your best effort. Submit that to me so I can go ahead and give you feedback, because that's actually more important, is to make an attempt and then get the feedback than to try to get it right the first time. Because if you make a mistake, that's okay, because you can, we can correct that. And then finally, there'll be 2 out of 4 short answers, same as last time. These are going to focus mainly on information from the chapters this time. A lot of our discussions, we only had 1 for this second half of the course, and even still it was more of a technical type of a question, asking about stimulus control. So really it's going to focus on the more theoretical concepts. So I won't go over what to go over in each chapter because it's included in the handout. Just read the review sheet. As always, the RATs are really important. If it was on the RAT, make sure you know it, make sure you understand it. So what we talked about in general in the review session was, let me just open my notes real quick. Right. So, we talked about the importance of understanding the distinction between instrumental and operant conditioning, and basically just the fact that in instrumental conditioning, the organism is not free to operate on the environment. Okay, they have to wait for some external agent to set up the new trial. Okay, so when we talk about Tolman, well, for one, operant conditioning hadn't been invented yet because we're talking about back in the 30s. But 2, it was necessarily instrumental because whenever the rat goes through the maze, he has to be taken out before he can be put back in. So that's actually instrumental conditioning from a methodological perspective. The other thing that makes it instrumental is more historical. It's the fact that when Thorndike developed instrumental conditioning, he thought it was a stimulus that got associated with the response. Okay, so he thought that the reinforcer just strengthens that association between the stimulus and the response. Well, actually, later on, when we look at operant conditioning, we say, well, no, it's really just the response and the outcome. The stimulus is just a signal. It doesn't actually create a kind of an association where, whenever the stimulus is presented, the organism automatically engages in the response. That just doesn't happen that way. Okay, So there's two things that make it different. One is methodological, and the other is that historical understanding that it's a, instrumental conditioning was supposed to be stimulus response learning, and operant conditioning is response outcome learning, or response S-star learning. Now, we don't go into a lot of different theories of operant conditioning because there are many. I mean, we talk about Hull, obviously Skinner, and that's radical behaviorism, okay, and that kind of theory with operant conditioning. And there's a lot of others as well, but we really just want to talk about Skinner. And I mentioned one more, though, that's not as detailed as Hull and his whole drive reduction theory, which is extremely complicated, okay? And we talk about Guthrie just for a little while. Now, I won't go into a great amount of detail, but the importance of Guthrie is to point out that not everyone thought the reinforcer, or consequently the punisher, was really the most important part of conditioning. In fact, his theory doesn't even need a reinforcer, okay? He basically just recognizes, and if you look at the picture, which is on the lecture slides, he just thought that whenever stimuli in the environment were associated with a response, and were only associated with that one response, that over time, the more stimuli in the environment get associated with just that one response, the more likely the organism is to engage in that response whenever he sees those stimuli again. So it's an instance of instrumental conditioning where you put the organism in the box, he engages in some behavior from his repertoire, okay? Whatever it is, he's going to be aware of where he's at, that there's stimuli, and he's going to engage in some behavior. Now, if you immediately take him out of the situation, he didn't get a chance to associate any of those stimuli in the environment with anything except that first behavior he did. Now, what Guthrie says is, the next time you put him in, he's more likely to pick up on those stimuli that he saw the first time, and because of that, he'll engage in the behavior. But the second time, he also picks up on a few other stimuli in the environment, okay? And so each time he picks up on more stimuli in the environment, each time those are getting associated with the response. Now, that's not an automatic response, though. So that's the difference. The stimuli in the environment don't cause him to engage in the behavior. He just engages in the behavior just in his repertoire. It's a normal curve of stuff that he just does. But the experimenter controls the association of that volitional behavior with whatever he experiences in the environment, so that the only thing he ever does in that environment is that one behavior. At first, it's just random chance, but afterwards, Guthrie says that eventually he's going to be engaging in that because he's associated with the environment. Is that the case? No, not really. That's just not how it works. It's really operant conditioning. One of the things we talked about potentially as a criticism of this, of Guthrie's theory, is that even taking an organism out of the box could be considered a reinforcer, okay? It could either be just feeling the warmth of the hand of the experimenter, that can be a reinforcer, but also, perhaps the box isn't as reinforcing as the rat's cage, where he has access to food and everything, so taking him out is reinforcing again. So it's possible, there's a confound there in his study. But the importance is not to consider this as a valid theory of, instrumental or operant conditioning. It's really just to recognize that there are other ways of thinking about it. Okay, we're not going to go into the more complex ones, but just be aware of that. I won't go over all the different mazes, but I'll just highlight the fact that Tolman's idea was that behavior was flexible, and that a stimulus wasn't linked to a specific response. Like with the water maze, the stimulus was being in the maze, and the organism learns to swim to get the reinforcer. If the stimulus was linked to a specific behavior and it was completely inflexible, then being in the maze would result in swimming. And so the second you drain the water out, the organism should still swim. He should basically just fall on his side and be like, paddling, and trying to figure out why he's not moving, which doesn't happen. As soon as you drain the water out of the maze, the organism runs through the maze, because behavior is flexible. Okay, it achieves a goal, it achieves outcome. The organism will engage in whatever behavior is most adaptive and most easily gets him to that outcome. Okay, so behavior is flexible. Rewatch the lecture where I explain all that stuff and all the different mazes and what it means. But the take-home point is that behavior is flexible. And organisms respond to the environment in a way that's most adaptive, even in operant conditioning. Okay, it's just that they adapt the behavior. Whereas in the previous, I'm not even going to go into what we talked about in the last things. Let's just focus on behavior. Okay. So it's really important. It's crucial that you understand what a discriminative stimulus is. Okay, a discriminative stimulus is something that indicates to an organism. It doesn't elicit anything. It just indicates. It's a signal. It says, hey, if you engage in this behavior right now, you'll get a reinforcer or a punisher, either way. And the SD, the other side of that discriminative stimulus, because there's always two parts. It's the one that signals, yes, if you do the behavior, you'll get something. There's going to be another part that's going to say, if you do that behavior, you're not going to get anything. Okay. Now, obviously, an organism doesn't know this to begin with. That's why you have discrimination training. So first, the organism just learns the behavior in the presence of the SD. And he learns that behavior, and he's doing fine. Now you turn that SD off, but he doesn't know that that means anything, so he goes to do whatever the behavior is, but then nothing happens. And so behavior starts to go into extinction, and it starts to decrease. Now the SD comes back on, his behavior gets reinforced again, so now it's going to increase again. But then that SD goes off. Now the third, fourth time that happens, he's starting to build that association. It's not Pavlovian, okay, but it is somewhat of an association. So he's starting to have an understanding that if the light's on, it means press the bar and you'll get something. If the light's off, I need to just go do something else in my repertoire because it's a waste of my energy to keep trying to press the bar. That's stimulus control. That's the essence of it, is that something in the environment can tell the organism whether or not engaging in the behavior is going to be adaptive, okay? And they will modify their behavior based on those stimuli in the environment. So that's discriminative stimuli, That's the SD and the S delta. The SD is the one that says, yes, you'll get something. The S delta is the one that says, no, you will not. Now, when we talk about fading, the basic premise is that a light on or off is a very easy SD, S delta combination for an organism to learn. They're very salient. It's very clear whether the light's on or off. It's a good signal. It stands out from other things. And if it's consistently linked with whether or not they get the reinforcer or not, then it's perfect. You do a number of discrimination training trials, and he'll figure it out. But there are other discriminative stimuli that aren't so good, okay? Things that are hard for a rat or a pigeon to discriminate between, okay? In the example in the lecture, it's the horizontal, or vertical lines. A pigeon can't discriminate well with that. It's not very adapted to his particular physiology or whatever, his eyesight to understand the difference between those two. But with fading, what we do is we use a good set of discriminative stimuli, ones that have already been trained, so they're already working. He already knows to peck at the disc whenever the light is on and not peck whenever the light is off. Use a good set, and now you present the SD, which you want to train, the one that it's not really good at, by always presenting it whenever you're presenting the old SD, the one that the organism already knows really well. You just present them at the same time. So he gets the light and he also gets the lines, at first, he's just responding to the light. The lines are there, and he says, wow, that's good, but he's responding to that light at first. Same thing with the light off, and now he sees maybe the vertical lines. He's responding to the fact that the light's off. He doesn't care that the lines are vertical, because that's not, he doesn't understand that well. However, you do that enough times, and eventually you start to actually fade out the old discriminative stimuli, the ones he was real good at. And the cool thing is, he keeps responding to the horizontal lines as a SD and the vertical lines as an S delta. So basically, you can use good SDs and S deltas to train an organism to respond to bad SDs and S deltas, ones that he would normally have difficulty distinguishing between. But you can use those good SDs, and then you just train it up and then fade out the old ones, and the new ones will work. That's it. That's basically fading. Now, it's real important that you understand the behavior chain. If you've submitted homework to me and I've read it, I actually think you guys really did a good job at understanding it. Okay? Those of you who submitted assignments to me based on the behavior chains really got it. But the main point is that you start with a link in that chain. I recommend starting with the link in the chain that's at the end. Okay? And that link is what we talked about in that Module 8 assignment. It's the three-term contingency. It's an SD, a response, and an outcome. Okay? Now, in the types of behavior chains we're going to talk about, we're just going to focus on outcomes which are positive reinforcement, and we're going to talk about a food pellet. Okay? So that last chain needs to be something that has positive reinforcement, okay? And it actually has to be a primary reinforcer, not a secondary one. It's a primary one. Food, sex, water, substances, drugs, something like that, So we'll start with that. We'll say it's a food pellet, okay? Food pellet. Now, what behavior do you want him, the organism to engage in to get the food pellet? What's up to you? But for our instance, let's just pick something simple, something we know already. Let's just say a bar press. So the organism presses the bar, he gets a food pellet. He will learn to press that bar very frequently. Very simple. Now we add in the last part of that three-term contingent, which is the SD. Let's call it a light. So we train him using discrimination training that whenever the light's on, you'll get a food pellet if you press the bar, but whenever the light's off, you're not going to get a food pellet. Okay? So that's our SD. And we got light on. Okay. So we consider that a link in the chain. Okay? That's the final link in the chain. But we want him to do some other stuff. We want him to engage in multiple behaviors in a sequence to be able to get to that food pellet. So here's the trick. That SD, the light being on, we are now going to pretend that that's a reinforcer. And we're going to use it just like we would use any other reinforcer to reinforce another behavior. A behavior that comes before this final link. We can pick whatever the behavior is. In the discussion section, someone said climbing. Okay? So let's say he's happy. The light's on, he presses the bar, he gets food, sometimes it goes off, and he just walks around, he wanders around because he doesn't want to waste his time. Okay? Now all of a sudden, a barrier comes up. Right? And he can't see the light. He doesn't have access to the bar. Okay? And so we want to reinforce him climbing up over that thing. Do we reinforce it with a food pellet? Like every time he rears up, we give him a food pellet? Nope. No, we don't want to do that. Like I said before, we're going to use the SD in that other final link of the chain like it was a reinforcer. So what we want to do is we want to show him that light whenever maybe he rears up. Maybe we have to train it up, or maybe we don't even need to. I could actually think of putting the light where if he rears up, he'll see the light. Okay? Now, I mean, technical issues aside, we would probably have to do some additional work to get him to actually climb up and over it to fully see the light. But the truth is, the organism will climb not to get the reinforcer, because organisms don't think that way. He's climbing to see the light because we know that SDs are actually conditioned reinforcers. So he will learn a response, which is climbing to see the light. Climbing to see the light. That sounds like an old 80s rock song or something, huh? Climb over barricade. Okay, so you see, he'll climb over the barricade so that he can see the light. And if the light is on, the light's still functioning as a discriminative stimulus. So that means once he sees the light, now he's going to go press the bar and he's going to get the food pellet. Okay? Now we decide we need another SD or S delta. Okay? And we can add that. So there's going to be something else that's going to control whether or not, when he climbs that barricade, whether the light's going to be on or off. And we could set it to be, a tone. Why not? So he'll hear a tone. If he hears the tone, okay, and he'll learn through discrimination training, whenever he climbs up and he hears the tone, or anytime the tone is playing, so maybe it's a continuous tone. Anytime that tone is playing and he climbs up, he'll see the light. Then he presses the bar, then he gets the food pellet. Okay? Now, through many trials, sometimes the tone goes off, and he'll learn that whenever he climbs up the barricade, whenever the tone's not on, there's no light. Again, we're treating that light just like it was a reinforcer. Okay? And so he'll learn to climb whenever the tone's on, but not when it's off. Okay? So now we have another link in the chain, which is the tone discriminative stimulus, climbing the barricade, get the reinforcer, which is the light being on. Okay? We can create a whole new link in the chain. Now we just have to use the tone as a reinforcer. It's an SD for climbing the barricade, but we can use it as a reinforcer for some other behavior which will build up. And then we can have an SD for that one, and then we can have another behavior for that one, and then we have an SD for that, and just keep going back. This is actually called backward chaining. Okay? Now you can also do it forward. You can start basically with the tone climbing the barricade, and then you give a reinforcer, but then you change the reinforcer from primary reinforcer to the secondary conditional reinforcer, and then you go on and on and on. I actually prefer the backwards chaining. I think it's easier to understand, so just stick with that one. Okay? But basically hopefully you can see this, but this is my crude drawing of how that works. You see, you have an SD, which leads to a behavior. That behavior is going to yield an SD, but we're treating it like it's a reinforcer. And because this reinforcer still is an SD, it's going to indicate that if he presses the bar, he'll get the food pellet. So that's a behavior chain. That's how it works. Okay? And you can see the slides for a definition of that. I won't say much about schedules of reinforcement, the graphical depiction. I mean, you have that information. Just understand, be able to define each schedule. Now, I gave feedback on assignments. A couple people were just a little off about some of the schedules of reinforcement. So see my feedback, tweak it if you got something wrong. Just make sure you understand what each one is. With the qualitative law of effect, which is basically comes from Hertzstein's matching law, the only thing you need to understand is how one reinforcer can impact another reinforcer. So the reinforcer for one behavior actually has an effect on the other behavior if you increase or decrease that. So it's the rate of reinforcement. That's the only thing I really want you to know. You don't actually have to do any graphing or equations or anything like that, because we didn't do that in the lecture either. In lecture 7, we go into talking about generalization. Now, I know some of you said that you had problems with the generalization gradient, okay? And I'd just like to give you a quick explanation of what that is. Anytime you do generalization training, again, there's two phases. First, you have to do discrimination training. That's the first step. And then this just goes back to, you have to train him to respond in the presence of the SD and not respond in the presence of the S delta. Okay, so we just go right back to that. He's responding to the light, he's not responding to no light. Okay, but here's the interesting part. Okay, and we can get into prototype or feature theory or whatever, but what are the qualities of that SD? What are the qualities of the light? Okay, if it's a white light and we know he responds to that, I always say 30 times a minute. During discrimination training, when it's completely trained up, he's responding 30 times a minute. When it goes off, he almost immediately stops responding. Maybe he hits it a couple more times, twice, but almost no responding. So we got 30 to the SD, 2 or 0 to the S delta. Well, we can actually test the boundaries of that SD in terms of what are other stimuli that, how similar or how different do the stimuli need to be to get him to respond. We can test that. So what we do in phase 2, it's called Generalization Test. We go into extinction trials, meaning that we remove the ability for the organism to get the reinforcer. Now, of course, during extinction trials, behavior is going to decrease, but it doesn't decrease at first. And also, we can counterbalance and use groups and do a lot of other stuff, so that we're testing to see during the extinction trials, before it fully extinguishes, we can test how much he responds in response to that discriminative stimulus, to that SD. So to the light, at first he's still going to respond 30 times a minute. Okay? So that's good. He responds 30 times a minute to the stimulus that he previously found is supposed to signal that reinforcement is available. But what if the stimulus is a little bit different? So if it was a white light, would he still respond to a red light? I mean, it's still a light. It has some of the qualities of a white light, but it doesn't have all of them. It's slightly different. What about a fluorescent black light? I don't know. Will he respond to that the same way? I mean, I'll tell you right now, we know organisms are very sensitive to changes in the stimuli that they learn predict certain things. And so that's all the generalization test is we're going to come up with a number of different stimuli. Some we think are somewhat close to the SD, and some that are extremely different than the SD, and we want to see how many times he's going to respond to that. So in this case, let's say we're using the white light, and we said he's going to respond to that 30 times on average per minute. Okay? We're going to get the largest peak to that white light. Okay? So we're going to get about 30. On average, over different groups and counterbalance, we're going to get about 30 responses to that on average. Okay? Now, a light which is kind of a yellowish, but a very light yellow, okay? Would he respond 30 times to it? What we find out is no, he's not going to, because it's just a little bit different. It doesn't share all of the properties of the white light, but it shares some of them. So he might respond a little bit less, maybe to 25 or something like that. Okay? Now, I don't know color theory, but I would guess if yellow is a more neutral kind of lower end, then going up in intensity, I don't know, maybe a bluish, a light bluish color. And maybe that's going upwards in intensity, but still it's a lighter color, and so he's also going to respond to it about 20, 25, still kind of high though. Okay, but now going up in intensity, maybe we go to a deep red or something like that, really, really bright red. Well, that's not really similar at all to a white light, and so maybe he only responds to that 5. And on the other end of the spectrum, I have no clue. Pink? I don't know. An intense? No, it couldn't be pink. Whatever. It could be green. Why not? Green. A very intense, deep green color. And he's not going to respond to that very much. So what you end up having is this gradient where only the SD has the high frequency of responding because he previously learned to respond at that frequency to that SD. The stimuli that are very close to the SD are going to be similarly high, but not as high as that SD, and the ones that aren't similar at all are going to be very different. Why is this important? Well, it's because we don't always know what makes a stimulus similar or not. That's why we do a generalization test, because it can tell us a little bit about how the organism forms those associations. Okay? So that's a generalization gradient. It's based on how similar the alternative stimuli are to the target stimuli. So in the homework, you have a circle, which is pretty similar to a C. I mean, the only difference is that the C is just missing a little segment. A circle, however, is not similar at all to an X. Okay? So, which one do you think the organism is going to respond to? And I'll still leave it to you to do that. So if you haven't done it yet, please give it a shot, and I will give you the feedback. So that's pretty much it. The only other thing I think I should say is that in terms of cognition of time and space, just focus on the slides, give them a quick read, and understand that information. So hopefully this will help you to finalize whatever you've been studying, and refresh yourself and get a bit of clarification if you're having trouble with the activities. Again, I really just, if you haven't done them yet, just go ahead and make an attempt so I can get you the feedback, okay? Don't be so concerned about how many points off, because I usually don't get too many points off, as long as I see that you put in effort, okay? So do that. We got 15 hours, and you will be free of me for life. Just think of it that way. So I'll see you all later today.